Hi and welcome.
Wait.
Hey listener, have you rated our podcast yet? Help us get 100 ratings and 30 reviews by November. We need your stars. Okay, proceed.
Okay, thanks. And hi, welcome to the Let's K12 Better podcast. This podcast is a project between Mom of All K Center kids.
Hi! In our podcast, we will cover a variety of subjects involving K-12 education and family life.
We will talk about the ways that parents, kids, and educators can improve K-12 education and family life. We encourage you to join our conversation on social media using the hashtag Let's K12 Better. Let's jump in to episode 20 of the Let's K12 Better podcast.
Often, parents want to get more involved with their child's education but are unaware of the variety of volunteer and advocacy opportunities available to parents. Parent engagement and parent advocacy can take a school and school district to the next level.
When you hear parent-teacher association, parent-teacher organization, or parent association, what comes to mind? We hope it's not just bake sales and hyper-controlling super-cliquey moms. A school's PTA, PTO, and PA is there to make the school a better place for all students. This could include purchasing small and large items for the school, community events, or even support programs for families in need. But did you know that parent advocacy in schools, it doesn't just stop at the school PTA?
This summer, we sat down with Jim Bradley, parent and education advocate, to discuss the importance of parent participation at all levels of the school system. Jim brings his experience as a WJ cluster representative working with PTA representatives from schools across our district. We hope our discussion with Jim inspires you to get more involved in your PTA at every level.
We are delighted to have Jim Bradley, parent and education advocate, with us today for the podcast. Welcome to the podcast, Jim.
Thanks, Amber. I'm really happy to be here. This is a really great opportunity.
Awesome. I think we're going to have a great conversation. So we're going to start with our first question.
You are a former WJ cluster coordinator in Montgomery County, Maryland. Can you share with the listeners what that role means and the responsibilities involved with that role? A.
Sure.
Is it a PTA role or a role all on its own? B. How does your role connect with the PTA, the school board, and the community?
That's a great question, Naima, and I'm happy to explain it. So the Montgomery County public schools are divided into clusters, and each cluster is centered on the high school. So it's the high school and the middle school or middle schools and the elementary schools that feed up into that high school. That's all called a cluster. And so the PTA, there's a county-wide PTA organization, the Montgomery County Council of PTAs, and that is also organized by cluster. And so as a Walter Johnson cluster coordinator, what that meant is that I was one of 3 people elected by the 9 PTAs that feed into Walter Johnson High School. So Walter Johnson High School, the 2 middle schools, North Bethesda and Tilden, and then the 6 elementary schools, Garrett Park, Farmland, Lux Manor, Kensington Parkwood, Wingate, and Ashburton. And so they elected 3 of us to represent the cluster to the larger PTA organization and be in before the decision-making bodies in the county. Then the most important ones are the county council and the county executive, the county board of education and the school department, and the Montgomery County Planning Board. And so my job was to work with our 9 schools to create consensus positions around the issues that were facing our community and advocate on behalf of the community and organize the community to advocate on, for itself in the budget process, the planning process, and on issues that the school department was grappling with, while also trying to work in community with the other clusters, the ones that surrounded us, and we're in kind of a central location in our part of the county, and clusters throughout the county on issues that mattered at the county level and also at the state level. Although I did a lot less work with the state government than some of the other clusters did, we did do some advocacy with our state legislature and the governor's office.
Sounds like a lot of moving parts, and a lot of getting people, I guess, like organized and, all marching in the same direction. How can you actually expand a little bit on your relationship with the other cluster coordinators as just a follow up? Like, how did that work with the other schools cluster people?
So there were three of us with our representing Walter Johnson, and then most other clusters had two or three cluster coordinators as well. And what it with issues that we were only one piece of the 25 schools, so we couldn't do anything on our own. We had to build relationships with our neighbors. And what's one of the things that I learned a lot about this process when I became a cluster coordinator and when I got involved in education issues here is how we really are. We're a massive county. We have more than 1 million people who live here, and there's almost 170,000 students. We're the 14th largest school district in the country. But we really are just a collection of neighbors. And I learned to do a lot of listening, and I learned to try to find consensus and common ground where I could, and to use we were, pretty well organized area, to use that organization to advocate for ourselves, but also to advocate for our neighbors when they needed something. And it was fun. It was hard. It was challenging. One of the nice things about sharing the cluster coordinator role with two other people was that we were able to play on each other's strengths and weaknesses, so that we could and divide the load a little bit, which was really helpful. And we had representatives from each of our 9 schools who are cluster representatives who sort of operate as an advisory body to us and connect our work directly down to the schools that we represented. So they were really a good crew of about 20 of us, and learning to work with one another and to learn about some of the very different challenges that our schools face in our community versus in our neighboring communities. I mean, one example of that is part of what got me into this work was that our area was seeing massive overcrowding in our schools, while there was increasing new development. The planning board and the county council were approving more and more developments, which was going to in the future lead to more overcrowding. And I felt like I wanted to get involved because I saw the impact that overcrowding was having on our kids. We are in a relatively wealthy and relatively sort of well-off part of the county. There are other parts of the county that really were looking to see more development, looking to see some economic growth because of there were significant issues of poverty, and they wanted to see investment in their community in a way that was very different from what we were advocating for, and trying to find a way to work together to solve problems in our neighbors' community while also trying to deal with the impacts we were seeing was a real eye-opening experience for me, because I didn't grow up here, and so I didn't know this area as well as many other folks do. Although this is an area where there are people who come from all over the country, because we're right outside of Washington D.C., and from all over the world, because we are a welcoming community. So it's a real melting pot in a lot of ways, and that's been a challenge to take in everybody else's perspective and process that, and then figure out how to plug into that in a respectful way.
Awesome. So you kind of touched upon this, but we'll go into our next question.
How did you get involved in this role? What got you interested in volunteering and engaging at this level?
So the reason, as I alluded to, the reason I got involved is I had seen significant overcrowding in our area. We had our elementary school was expanded to take in the new students that would be generated from a new development that was about to happen on the site of the old White Flint Mall. And that development never actually happened for a whole host of reasons involving lawsuits and greedy developers. But nonetheless, our school was overcrowded anyway, and the county government, particularly the school department, just really botched the enrollment projections, and it was so clear and so evident that when you pack more and more kids into a school, there are the impacts grow. So you have portable classrooms which are not as safe and not as welcoming, and they sit on the land that was a play space that was where the playground was. And when you have when you have 650 kids in the school or 950 kids in the school, there's only one principal and there's only so many counselors, and the classes grow in size. And I was frustrated by seeing mismanagement and the failure of the government to do what I thought needed to be done to help make sure our kids were getting a quality education. And so, you know, real, I have you can complain about what the government is doing, or you can get involved and try to change it. And that's one of the things that I hear a lot in your podcast is the need for civic engagement and the need for for constructive activism. And I came from an activist background of sorts. I spent 11 years as a congressional staffer, and I've spent the last 10 years as an environmental advocate and lobbyist. And so I wanted to put the skills that I use in my day job to work on behalf of my community. So I represented our elementary school as a cluster rep to this larger cluster structure, which I had not really heard much of. And I did that for a year, and my colleagues and neighbors asked me if I would serve as a cluster coordinator, and I said no, because that looks like a lot of work, and I don't know what I'm doing, and that looks like a lot of work, and it would be really hard. And they begged me to do it. I said, fine, I'll do it for a year, but that's it. I can't do it for any more. And I ended up doing it for 3. So once you sort of fall into these things, it can be hard to get out. But that was how I got involved. I wanted to put my experience to work on behalf of my community and try to solve some problems.
Right on. That's super awesome. And we can attest to the fact that you are amazing at this. And also just attest to the fact that civic engagement and parent involvement is super duper important, which leads us to our next question. All right. So come up here.
What did you learn about your experience as a WJ cluster coordinator? What advice do you have for parents wanting to engage?
So any advice you have for parents wanting to engage in addition to lessons learned?
So I guess I'll take the second question first, because they're both really, really good questions. And the advice I'd have for parents who want to engage is go for it. It's incredibly rewarding. It's frustrating at times, and it's hard. And sometimes there can be late nights, and you start to question what you're doing. But in the end, you really can see some tangible change. And getting involved in your community is just something that will ultimately make you feel good. And there's so much need right now. And so the more practical advice as to what to do, look for, think about what it is that you care about, what you're passionate about, what issues make you go, whether it's in education or the environment or civil rights, whatever is, whatever that thing that bothers you when you go to sleep and that thing you think about when you wake up, that's where you should put your passion. And so then you start looking around for the structures that plug into that effort. I joined the PTA because that's what one does when, I was like, oh, I'll send them my $25 check and I'll, support whatever it is they're doing. I didn't really know, and I didn't pay much attention when my daughter was in kindergarten. And then when she was in first grade, we actually had some pretty significant issues with the way the school and the way the PTA in particular was running a fundraiser. We thought the fundraiser they ran was manipulative, and it did not have any eye towards equity and put the kids in a really difficult position. And my wife and I did some pretty serious complaining about that to the PTA and to the administration of the school. And so you get to that point where you're like, I'm complaining and I'm getting involved and I'm mad and I want to do something. I can fire off an angry email and that temporarily feels good, or I can say, well, if they can't, I can do it better, or I can, I can certainly get involved and try to make sure this never happens again. And from there, I kind of figured out where my skill set best lay, and they were soliciting volunteers to get involved in some of the development and projection and political questions around the what was going on in the cluster. And I thought, well, I can do that, maybe. I don't know, we'll find out. um, but it really is joining. Be a joiner. Join groups, join organizations. Think about what makes you tick, what keeps you up at night, what issues you've always wanted to get involved in. You can volunteer for things that aren't your job, because you can walk away if you need to, and it gives you an outlet outside of what they pay you to do. So that's sort of some real basic advice. In terms of what did I learn about my experience, it's really hard to think about education issues in this county now without thinking about questions of equity and race. And those are not things that I spent a lot of time thinking about, and I'm not proud of that, but I'm not embarrassed to say it. I mean, I think it's important to acknowledge shortcomings. And as I started working at the larger county-wide level and learning more about what goes on in this county, my eyes were opened to the the fact that our school system in Montgomery County is segregated, and there are inequities between our schools, between an elementary school, one right next to another, and that's not okay. And we who have privilege, and we who have time on our hands, and who have the skill set to work on behalf of schools, need to be thinking about what we can do to help all the schools and all kids. And that took that took some hard listening. It took hearing hard truths, but being willing to listen and be willing to engage. um, I think that made me a better advocate first and foremost, but it also, I think, made me a more effective advocate within this county structure, because you need to understand the whole context when you're an advocate. You can't just be looking at your narrow issue. You've got to look at the whole context that issue lives in, and that was something that I think I really I got a lot out of, and I carry that. I'm no longer a cluster coordinator, but I carry that with me as I engage with my community.
Wow. Yeah, that is what you shared is super insightful and amazing, and listening being one of the first steps toward kind of like dismantling some of the inequities that we know that are there but aren't sure how to address them. So appreciate you lifting that up. I also want to point out like the whole unlearning and co-learning aspect of what you shared as well. So like super appreciative of you just mentioning how like you were more aware of that and how that helped you out.
What are the potential barriers to participation at this level? Did you or others experience any barriers during your tenure?
Yeah, Garvey, there are a lot of barriers to participation. So Montgomery County is a large county, and it's got a lot of people, it's got a lot of money, and it's got a lot of processes that that require constant sort of input and energy to move the needle. And I mean political processes, and that takes a lot of time. There, you can drive yourself crazy by going to 3, 4, 5, 6, 10 meetings a week. To if you got to show up to a board of ed meeting and a board of ed hearing and a county council hearing and a budget work session the county executive is putting on, and a planning board work session on a development plan, and then community meetings and school meetings. There are a lot of people I know who are basically full-time activists. They either have a small part-time job, or they don't have a job at all. Their spouse is earning the income for their family, and that's a barrier, a barrier to participation, an entry barrier that is enormous. I was not able to go to all the meetings that maybe some would have wanted me to. I have a job, and my wife has a job, and at the time, right now I'm working from my bedroom, but at the time I was working downtown, and just getting to a 5 o'clock meeting in Rockville when you're working in DC is you have to leave work early. So sometimes I could pull that off, and other times I couldn't. Going to a 1 o'clock meeting on a Thursday was pretty hard. And so what that means is that voices that are disproportionately lifted up are those who have the means and ability to not only understand the political structure, but contribute the time and energy that it takes to engage with that. And there is also a lot of assumed knowledge that sometimes happens. I didn't know the different personalities on the Board of Ed, or what department at MCPS does what, or what had happened in the 2010 zoning text amendment to the White Flint One sector plan. And you can sometimes feel like people are throwing jargon at you that doesn't mean anything, but if you don't know it, then you're stupid and you couldn't possibly be a good advocate. There's a clubbiness that sometimes comes with PTAs or with community organizations that can also be a barrier, and not surprisingly, it can be a barrier. That barrier can be exacerbated when you don't look like or have the same background or heritage as the people who are currently involved in that power structure. Montgomery County is not a white majority school system, but you wouldn't necessarily know that from going to a PTA meeting. There have been efforts by the school department and by some in the PTAs to help raise some voices of people who aren't necessarily represented at the table and haven't been in the past because of their race or socioeconomic status. But the bottom line is, if you're working 3 jobs to keep food on the table and a roof over your kids' heads, you don't have time to go to a planning board meeting or a Board of Ed meeting, and there are just going to be limits. And so we as advocates need to be, and really our policymakers need to be thinking about how to bring the community, bring these processes to the community. Why do we have to have Board of Ed meetings in Rockville? Why does the planning board have to have a meeting in its office to discuss a zoning plan that's 25 miles from its office? Why can't they have a community meeting there? Why do they have to have them at 3 o'clock on a Tuesday? Why can't they have it at 1 o'clock on a Saturday? These are things that are changing, but they have not changed.
Yeah. Well, hopefully now that the world has, slipped into this virtual space and online meeting, hopefully there'll be more creative solutions, which kind of leads into our next question about, maybe thinking about other ways that parents can get involved. So can you share?
Okay. From your experience, what are some ways that parents can get involved in school district politics and activism?
So it's funny. Montgomery County is this kind of funny place where a lot of the parents here are super knowledgeable about minute, obscure details of the federal government because we're right outside of the Capitol. People are, they can tell you who the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Labor is, but they couldn't tell you who their school board members are, or how many members of the school board represent them even. We have a curious structure here in Montgomery County where we have 2 at-large members of the Board of Ed, and then 5 district members of the Board of Ed, and then there's a student elected member for a total of 8. But each, where the at-large of the district really only matters for where the candidate lives. We all vote for all of the districts and all of the at-large seats, and so the adults in the county have 7 Board of Ed members who represent them equally, and then the kids have 1 that only the children elect, and that student member of the board has full voting rights. The only things they're not allowed to vote on are personnel matters, but they have full rights when it comes to budgets and boundaries and policy positions. It's actually pretty cool and unusual nationwide. But to answer your question, one of the first things that people can do is start to understand who their local officials are. Lots of people know who their president is. It's hard to miss him these days. They know who their senator is, and maybe then their governor, and maybe they know who their member of the House of Representatives is. But they start to not really know who their county council members are and their county executive. sort of the governor of the county. The county executive has a lot of power here, and they're board members. But the reality is that those people um, have an enormous influence on your day-to-day life. The board of ed members are going to decide whether you kids go back to school in the fall, and what that looks like. That's not going to be a decision that your congressman makes or your senator makes. And the county council will decide whether or not there will be new development in your neighborhood that will add, whether when they build new development in the neighborhood, I should say, whether there'll be a school that will be able to alongside it, so the schools won't be overcrowded. They set the budget for whether or not you're going to have teachers, whether they're going to be cutting teacher positions in the fall, and that they play an outsized role in people's lives here, and people don't know who they are. And you have 5 members of the county council who represent you. You have 7 members of the board of education who represent you, and so the first step is just education. Educate yourself. Learn who these people are. It's harder now because of the failures, the market failure of local journalism. But there are some pretty good reporters here in Montgomery County who do some good reporting. Caitlin Peets at the Bethesda Beat really works really hard to try to bring these stories to the forefront. And there are good local journalists in a lot of places, and I think that's a good first step. And the second step is to remember that these folks work for you. And so if there's something that you don't like, pick up the phone and give them a call. You'd be surprised that they will call you back because so few people know who they are. They really, when somebody takes the time to educate themselves on the issues and the personalities at play here, they will absolutely get back to you. I mean, you may not get the answer you like. That's okay. Um, and the second is to organize. One person by themselves can only achieve so much change. Sorry. Um, so to talk to your neighbors, I did a lot of educating my neighbors about what was going on in schools at the pickup and drop off line at school. um, your neighbors are there, things you can talk about, and go to the meetings when you can. Organizing, knocking on your neighbors' doors, getting together with people and just talking about what is happening and collecting stories is really important. But the first step is always educating. The first step is always learning who to talk to about what and why. And I think when you do that, you'll find that there are more people who are concerned about the issues that you're concerned about. But never take your voice for granted. Um, all these folks work for us, and our voices are powerful. They're more powerful when they're joined together, but they're very powerful.
All of the amazing things there. Thank you so much for that. So it leads into our next question.
Why do parent voices matter when it comes to things like building a new facility and making improvements district-wide?
So why do parent voices matter, essentially?
Well, I guess I'd answer the question with a question. If parent voices don't matter, then whose voices do matter? And we as parents are the most knowledgeable about our kids, and then we're most knowledgeable what our kids need, and then sort of building up from there, what our neighborhoods need, what our schools need, what our collection of schools may need. And I'm using, talking about this in the school context, but you can sort of swap out the word school and talk about streets or homes or whatever the local issue of the day is. It's about accountability. When government agencies and government actors make decisions without having hearing a variety of voices, and particularly the voices of the people who will be impacted by the decisions they make poorly informed choices. And when you make a poorly informed choice, usually the results are poor. Sometimes you get lucky, but most times you don't. One of the things that we found in the Walter Johnson cluster was that we kept looking at the data that was being generated for enrollment projections. So what they thought, the number of kids they thought were going to show up in schools in a couple of years, and saying, we just think those numbers are crazy. And we were told over and over again by very smart people who know what's best that no, you don't understand. You couldn't possibly understand this, and don't worry your pretty little heads. You're going to be fine. We know what we're doing, and the numbers were wrong. and they would be wrong again. And so finally, we started going through the development plans. We started going through the applications. And then we started looking at raw data, raw student enrollment data. How many kids are coming from each development? And what we found is that MCPS was lowballing the number of kids who live in apartments. They were sort of operating under this model where the only people who lived in single family homes had kids, and only the kids only lived in single family homes, which is just not true. And I say that as one apartment dweller here to another. And so eventually we were able to just present our data and testify to our data, and it took years, being told we were wrong. But ultimately, some of those enrollment formulas were changed because we were able to say, you're operating under this model where apartments are just for people without kids, and like that ain't the 21st century. Like, maybe you missed the housing crash. Like, people live in apartments, and that got those formulas changed. Are they where I would like to see them? No, I think that there's still some significant enrollment mistakes that are made, but had we not been there banging on the door, there would have been nothing. Likewise, we spent years telling MCPS that the schools in this area were going to be overcrowded because of development and because of neighborhood turnover, which is the sort of natural evolution of neighborhoods as people who are older, move away and sell their homes or pass on, and new wave of younger people come in and have babies and send their kids off to school. So neighborhood turnover is, roughly 70% of the increase in enrollment comes from that. About 30% comes from just new homes being built and people living there and thus sending their kids to the local school. Well, we were saying, the schools are going to be overcrowded. The schools are going to, we're going to need a new high school. And we were told over and over again, that's, you probably won't. No, and you won't need it soon. But we kept banging away, and we're going to get a new high school built now. Some of you may even go to it. The new Woodward High School is on the site of the old Tilden Middle School on Old Georgetown Road. That's going to be a high school, and it's going to open hopefully in 2025, maybe in 2026. And that's that was a result of parent advocacy. And one thing I'd add, at the risk of going on too long, is student advocacy is really important too. And that's a voice that I don't think gets maybe all the credit it deserves. But Montgomery County right now is looking at doing an analysis of our cluster boundaries, and the enrollment patterns. So who goes to what schools, and they're looking at it because we have two crises. We have a capacity crisis. We've got many schools that are overcrowded and a few that have some spare capacity, not as much as maybe some people think, but there is some. And we also have an equity crisis. We have schools that have right next to each other with vast socioeconomic and racial differences. And we have a bit of a transportation crisis. We've got a lot of people who are not attending the closest school. So we're just doing an analysis to look at how could you make changes to foster equity, to improve student outcomes, to solve some overcrowding problems, and to figure out where to target new capital investment. And that has led to some pretty ugly stuff in the press, and some not so veiled racism. But this analysis is going to move forward anyway. But the whole idea of the analysis was brought by the last two student members of the Board of Education, and the student government associations and student activists. And it is no way that it would have moved forward without their engagement and their really being a pain in the side of elected officials in this county. There is no way that would have happened without them. And students can be powerful. If we are actually going to do something about gun violence and in this country, it's going to be because students are tired of school shootings and are making their voices heard. And so I think parent involvement is really important, but I think student involvement is also really important.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. We do not engage students enough, and it's really important to engage them because it's training for adult life. So thank you for mentioning that. Okay, so we are going to segue into our final question.
Any closing thoughts about the PTA or positions like your former role?
Well, I've been rambling on for a while. I've got lots of thoughts, as you can hear. I feel a little I
Go
feel a
ahead.
little guilty as a you know as a well as someone who is an upper middle class cisgendered heterosexual white male who's born on life's proverbial third base. That I'm not sure my thoughts have been elevated for the last couple hundred years, but so I apologize for rambling on, but you did ask me, so here we are. I think in all seriousness, and with that introduction of myself there, the voices that maybe need to be elevated are the voices that haven't been. And I would love to see our PTAs and our community structures look like our county. Um, and that only happens if people get involved. And there are a lot of barriers to entry. Some of it is a barrier you know, of the structures of people who kind of like their comfort. They kind of like the way things are. And I don't see that as much in our community, but I do. It's not that it's not there. And that's something I'd like to see change. But I think a big piece of that is the people who are there really listening to some of those other voices. I know I had my eyes opened to the state of facilities in this county, educational facilities. I mean, there are schools, and thankfully some of them are being renovated, um, but not enough of them, that are in the poorer and majority black parts of this county that are in horrible condition. I mean, not they don't have working sprinklers. You know, they don't have working windows. They've got leaks. They've got exposed wiring. And you know, if those conditions were found in an area where people had the wealth and the time to commit to full-time activism, they would have been dealt with years ago. And that's not okay. Um, and so we've got to find ways to increase engagement, and we've got to find ways to empower people and empower the kids, but also to empower our neighbors, and to really, one of the thing that was hammered home to me, and I use the word neighbor a lot. I think my sense of what neighborhood is really expanding over time. But I do use the word neighbor because it's a word that comes up a lot in the Bible, and it's a word that comes up a lot in parlance. We talk about neighborhood schools and strong neighborhoods, and it goes back even to Mr. Rogers. We really need to look our neighbors in the eye and have hard conversations, and a lot of those hard conversations are about listening, listening to other people's life experiences, and then figuring out how to make meaningful change. And I think the problems of the country, some of them are so big, it's hard to sort of wrap your head around things. I mean, I work on climate change sometimes, and that's such a massive problem. It's hard to wrap your head around. But how to deal with local issues, how to change one voice, one aspect of your community that feels so much more manageable. So it getting engaged in local civic affairs gives you an opportunity to expand your neighborhood and become a better neighbor and make the world a better place. So that's, if it's done well. You can also, screw things up. So if people aren't getting involved who are screwing things up, you need to get involved and fix it. We all sort of have an obligation to do what we can, and what we can is very different for each person. Some people everybody gives their all. Some people just get to all faster than others, but um, we we all have an obligation to do what we can to try to solve problems in our community.
Wow, so much awesomeness. I just really want to highlight the neighbor part, and then working alongside or speaking with people instead of speaking for people, because that's really, really important when we work with equity and advocacy. So, Jim, you are amazing. Like, I really appreciate, you sharing all of your wisdom with our listeners. Hopefully it inspires people to engage deeper during the back to school season. So I just want to thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today.
Well, thanks for having me, and thanks for doing this. I've really enjoyed listening to the four of you on your podcast, and there's so much insight. There's so much there. It's really fun. It's fun to listen to, and it's really cool to be invited to be part of this. So thanks for having me.
We build stronger students when we build stronger schools and school districts. This happens when parents begin to see the success of their own child's education as dependent upon the success of every child in the school district. Until then, no school can reach its greatest potential.
Thank you, Jim Bradley, for joining us on the podcast. If you enjoyed today's interview, we encourage you to follow Jim on Twitter at JSBradley1977. And if you have any cool epiphanies that you'd like to share, please connect with us on social media.
Each episode, we will share quotes that we find inspirational. Michelle Obama is an American attorney, public speaker, and author who served as the First Lady of the United States from 2009 to 2017. Her quote, "When they go low, we go high."
Malala Yousafzai is a Pakistani activist for female education and the youngest winner of the Nobel Prize. Her quote, "If one man can destroy everything, why can't one girl change it?"
My quote is by Justice Sonia Sotomayor, who is an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States. My quote is, "Whether born from experience or inherit physiological or cultural differences, our gender and national origins may and will make a difference in our judging."
Zoe Saldana is an American actress best known for her parts in blockbuster movies like Star Trek, Avatar, and Guardians of the Galaxy. Her quote, "People think of Latina women as being fiery and fierce, which is usually true. But I think the quality that so many Latinas possess is strength. I'm very proud to have Latin blood."
Thank you for listening to the Let's K12 Better podcast.
If you enjoyed this episode, please rate, review, and subscribe.
We want to hear from you. Connect with us on social media at Let's K12 Better on all social media platforms, or connect with me on Twitter and Instagram at Mom of All Capes. We're on every podcasting platform, so if you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to rate and review our podcast. We're trying to reach 100 ratings and 30 reviews by November.
See you next time.